But now the Hellenes were brought face to face with a new difficulty. The winter had by this time set in, and the whole country was buried in snow. All around in every direction, as far as the eye could reach, was one vast stretch of snow, many feet in depth, and through this the Hellenes had to make their way. Anyone who has tried to walk for even a quarter of an hour through snow into which he cannot help sinking above the knee at every step he takes may imagine how tiring and painful it must have been to march thus for a whole day. Many of the slaves and horses perished, and also 30 of the soldiers. On the third day after crossing the Euphrates, their sufferings were still further increased by a north wind, whose bitter blast was torture even to the stalwart Hellenes. One of the soothsayers suggested that a sacrifice should be offered to Boreas, the god of the north wind, and, when this had been accomplished, it seemed to them all that his fury abated to some extent. When night came on, the Hellenes had to encamp in the snow. Those who first reached the camping place found plenty of food, and soon had some big fires burning, around which the stragglers were glad enough to press as soon as they arrived, but the first comers would only make room for them on condition of their giving them some of their bread, or anything else that they might have to eat, for food was now getting scarce. As the snow melted beneath the fires, the soldiers could measure its depth, and they found that it was no less than 6 feet. All the next day, the Hellenes had to plow their way through this terrible snow, and many became so faint and ill that they threw themselves down upon the ground, unable to move. When Xenophon, with the rearguard, came up to the place and saw them lying there in such misery, he asked his men if there was nothing that could be done for them. One of the older soldiers answered that the poor fellows were merely suffering from exhaustion caused by fatigue and want of food, and that, if they could get something to eat, they would be able to march on again. Xenophon went himself to the transport to get what he could for them, and, when the sick soldiers had taken some food, they revived and were able to keep up with their comrades. In the evening, Chrysippus and the van reached a village which had a wall around it and a gate that could be shut at night. When they arrived, they found some women and children drawing water at a well outside the village, who asked Chrysippus where he came from. He answered that he was on his way from the king to the satrap, and they told him that the satrap was not in the village, but at a place about 4 miles off. The women then went home, and the Hellenes of the van went with them through the gate and took up their quarters in the village for the night. But the other soldiers, who were a long way behind, had to spend the night in the open air with little or nothing to eat, and several of them died of cold and hunger. When, on the next day, they continued their march, some of those who had suffered most discovered a sheltered place where there was a warm spring that had not been frozen over nor covered up with snow. In a moment they threw themselves upon the warm black earth around the spring, and there they lay enjoying the hot steam that rose from it, when Xenophon, who always brought up the rear, came to the place and found them there. He told the men that they must not linger, as the enemy were close behind, and finding that mild words were of no avail, he spoke more and more sharply and even beat some of them. But the men would not move. They said that, if they must be killed, they were ready to die, but they could not go a step further. Meanwhile, the Persians were coming nearer and nearer. They had not failed to profit by the distress of the Hellenes and had captured the fallen baggage animals, who had been left lying in the snow. Now they were disputing over their prize with great clamor as they approached the spring. Xenophon ordered some of the least exhausted of his hoplites to charge and drive them back, and the sick men at the spring helped by shouting with all their might and striking their spears against their shields. The enemy were soon routed and fled as fast as they could, but were hindered by the snow. Xenophon then marched on, but, before leading the sick men, he promised that, as soon as possible, he would send some of their comrades to fetch them. That night, he again had to encamp with his men in the open, without either food or fire. When it was nearly morning, he sent some of his youngest soldiers back to the spring to fetch the sick men who had been left there the day before and bring them on their way. Many had died during the night, and for these there was nothing to be done but to bury them where they lay, but others who were still living, though unable to walk, had to be carried by their comrades. Going to see whether the men were performing their task faithfully, Xenophon was just in time to prevent a most barbarous action. One of the soldiers was digging a grave for a comrade who lay beside him, but, as he watched him, Xenophon saw the dead man move and called out to the soldier, "He is still alive." But the man answered, "He may have 10 lives as far as I am concerned." I will not drag him any farther." And it was only after having been well beaten that he consented to take up his burden again. Up to this time, the Hellenes had preserved their courage through all the difficulties and privations to which they had been exposed, or, if for a moment their spirits had flagged, they had quickly recovered themselves. But now the trial of excessive cold seemed to have robbed many of them of all manliness. It must be remembered that extreme cold has an exceptionally enervating effect, even upon men accustomed to it. But in this case, the sons of a country where frost and snow are unknown except in the mildest form found themselves suddenly exposed to the terrible cold of the high Asiatic tableland in the month of December. Moreover, they were absolutely unprovided with clothing suitable for such weather. The Hellene soldier wore but one garment and, besides this, had nothing whatever to protect him except that some of them, though by no means all, carried a great square of woolen cloth which they used as a cloak. We may rather wonder that so many kept up their spirits throughout this terrible march than that the courage of some should have failed. At last, all who were still alive of the sick men were brought away from the spring, and, before nightfall, the rearguard reached the village which had been already occupied for 2 nights by the van. Near were other villages, and the various companies drew lots for their respective quarters. Here they were able to rest in comfort after the privations of the last few days. The dwellings in this part of the country were made in a fashion that was quite new to the Hellenes. Instead of being built upon the ground, they were dug out of it, and had, for entrance, an opening like the mouth of a well, which widened out below into a large room, inhabited by the owner and his whole family, together with his goats, his sheep, his cattle, and his fowls. There were 2 ways of reaching it, a ladder for the human beings, and a slope of earth for the animals. Such dwellings are still common in Armenia, among the poorer classes, and like the cellars in which we keep our wine, they are cooler in summer and warmer in winter than the air outside. The houses in which the Hellenes took up their quarters were well stocked with food, and the hospitable villagers set before them maize and barley and other kinds of corn, as much as they desired. They had also a kind of barley beer, made with whole corns floating in it, which they drank through hollow reeds so that the corns should not choke them. When they wished to drink a toast to the health of one of their guests, they filled a great bowl with wine and, bending over it, lapped it up, as an ox drinks out of a pail. Then it was the turn of the guest, and he was expected to answer the toast by drinking to his host in the same manner. On the day after his arrival, Xenophon visited in turn all the villages and found the soldiers everywhere feasting and enjoying themselves. The friendly villagers had made them most welcome, and, when Xenophon arrived, they loaded the tables with flesh of lambs, kids, calves, and swine, besides fowls and bread both of maize and barley. It happened that this was the season for sending the yearly tribute of horses required by the great king from the province of Armenia, where the horses were smaller than those of Persia, but far more spirited. Finding in the villages a number of horses destined for this purpose, Xenophon did not hesitate to take one for his own use, and he advised the other officers to follow his example. The headman of the village was a priest of the sun god, and to him Xenophon gave the horse who had faithfully carried him through so many dangers, but who was now quite worn out and unable to go any farther, that he might be rested and well fed, and then offered as a sacrifice to the sun god. Xenophon was on very friendly terms with the headman and always invited him to dine with him at the same table. He had assured him that no harm would come to him and that the Hellenes would pay for whatever they took, if he, for his part, would help them on their way by acting as their guide till they came to the next country. The man agreed to this and, as further proof of friendship, showed the Hellenes the place where a great store of wine had been buried. The conversation between Xenophon and the headman was carried on through an interpreter, but the soldiers had to make themselves understood as best they could by means of signs and gestures. For 8 days, the Hellenes rested in the villages in order that they might thoroughly recover themselves before going farther. On the 9th day, they again set out and, by the advice of the headman, tied up their horses' hoofs in little bags of leather so as to give them a larger surface to tread upon, and thus prevent them from sinking as deeply into the snow as before. Chrysippus as usual led the van, and with him went the headman who was to act as guide. It was not thought necessary to bind him, as they had bound the Carduchian guide, for they had perfect confidence in him and felt sure that he would not desert them. But after marching for 3 days without coming to any villages in which they could shelter, Chrysippus reproached the guide, on the 3rd evening, for bringing them by such a bad way. The man answered that in that part of the country there were no villages, but Chrysippus did not believe him and, getting more and more angry, he ended by striking him. The next morning the guide was nowhere to be found. In consequence of this misadventure, there arose a quarrel between the two generals, the first and last in the whole course of the march. Xenophon became very angry and said that Chrysippus had committed 2 unpardonable blunders, first in striking the poor man who was doing his best for them, and secondly in that, after having ill-used him in this manner, he had not taken the precaution of putting him into chains in order to prevent his running away. The Hellenes had to suffer for the imprudence of Chrysippus, for now they were again without a guide. Nevertheless, they made their way onwards as best they could, and on the 8th day came in sight of the mountain range which forms the northern boundary of Armenia. The country north of Armenia was inhabited by the Taochians, a warlike and independent tribe, who soon made it clear that they were by no means disposed to welcome the intruding strangers. On approaching the border of Armenia, the Hellenes saw before them, at a distance of about 3 miles, a mountain range stretching away both to the left and right. The generals halted and brought up the troops in line, whilst waiting for the return of the spies, who had been sent on in front to find out whether there was any road leading over the ridge. When the spies returned, they reported that the only road led to a narrow pass, already occupied by the Taochians. It was evident that they would not be suffered to cross the mountains without a struggle, and Chrysippus gave orders that the men should at once take their dinner, during which time the generals were asked to discuss whether they should attack the pass immediately or wait till the next day. One of the generals, named Cleaner, had quickly made up his mind and was the first to speak. "It is well," he said, "that the soldiers should begin by making a good meal, but, this done, we must attack the enemy without delay. If we wait till tomorrow, they will think we are afraid of them, their spirits will rise, and many more of their friends will join them." But Xenophon was of a different opinion. "It is of the first importance," he said, "that we should lose as few men as possible in seizing the pass. The mountains stretch away to a distance of more than 6 miles, and no part of the range appears to be guarded except the road leading to the pass. It seems to me that it would be better for us to find a way over the unguarded part instead of attacking the enemy in their favorable position. For it is more easy to ascend by a steep road, if unhindered, than by a level road that is contested, and more possible to see in the night if there is nothing to distract us than in the daytime if there are enemies all around. Moreover, the rough road is better, if we are left in peace, than the smooth road, if stones are continually falling about our heads. We can steal away for ourselves under cover of the darkness at such a distance from the enemy that they will not hear us, especially if some of us divert their attention by advancing towards the pass as if we were going to attack it. But when I speak of stealing," he continued in a jesting tone, turning to Chrysippus, "ye Spartans, as I have heard, are accustomed to steal from your infancy. With you it is considered an honor to steal successfully, but, in order that you may learn to be skillful, he who is caught is scourged. Now you can give proof of the excellent training you have received. Help us to steal our way so cleverly that we shall not be caught and punished." Chrysippus took the jest in good part and replied in the same tone. "You also," he said, "ye men of Athens, have some experience in stealing, for I hear that, notwithstanding the risk of severe punishment, you know how to steal the treasures of the state, and the greatest robbers are those distinguished persons who hold the highest offices. For you too, therefore, there is now a chance of showing how well you can turn to account the lessons which you have learned at home." The plan proposed by Xenophon was adopted, and it was agreed that certain of the troops should climb the mountain and that others should advance along the road to the pass. The Hellenes were happily provided with guides who knew the country, for on the march they had captured some marauders who had followed at a little distance, hoping to find a favorable opportunity for stealing a few cattle. The prisoners had already been questioned and had said that the mountains were not impassable but were used as grazing ground for both goats and cattle, and that, if the Hellenes had command of any part of the ridge, they would be able to take the baggage animals over it without difficulty. Dinner being ended, Chrysippus led the army towards the pass occupied by the enemy, but halted at the distance of a mile from the mountains. When it was dark, the troops who were to climb over the heights marched away in the utmost silence. All went well, the soldiers met with no hindrance, and, having reached the top of the ridge, kindled a fire according to agreement, as a signal to those below that they had accomplished their task. The fire was seen also by the Taochians, who now perceived that they were in danger of being assailed on both sides, and they also lighted fires as a signal to their comrades to come to their help. In the morning, Chrysippus pressed forward along the road leading to the pass, and, at the same time, the other troops appeared upon the heights and began to make their way to the same place. The Taochians divided their men into 2 companies, the greater number remaining at the pass, whilst a smaller band marched out to meet the enemy on the ridge. Here, the first engagement took place, and the Hellenes soon defeated the Taochians and put them to flight. Meanwhile, Chrysippus was rapidly approaching at the head of the hoplites, having sent on the archers and slingers in advance, and, when the Taochians at the pass saw that their friends had been defeated on the ridge, they also turned and fled, so that the pass was won almost without fighting. As a remembrance of their victory, the Hellenes raised upon the mountain a trophy made of stones piled one upon another and decorated with the shields and arms taken from the Taochians. From hence they marched for 5 days through a level country, where they met with no resistance. But now provisions again began to fail. There was no lack of food in the country, but the Taochians had taken care to store everything within their castles, which were strong, fortified places, always perched on the top of some rugged height. The Hellenes did not think it prudent to attack these castles, and, in spite of their hunger, were forced to pass them by. On the 6th day, however, they came to a fortress which they were obliged to attack, for they were quite without food. It was built upon the edge of an overhanging cliff, and beneath it was a river and a road running beside the river. In this fortress, all the men, women, and children of the neighborhood had assembled, together with their cattle, and had piled together great heaps of stones to hurl down upon the Hellenes. Having tried in vain to find some means of taking the place, Chrysippus called a halt and waited until Xenophon came up. In answer to his question as to why they were at a standstill, Chrysippus replied, "The only approach to this place is by the road under the cliff, and, the moment we attempt to pass, they hurl down stones upon us from above, of which this is the result," and he pointed to some poor fellows lying on the ground whose legs and ribs had been broken. As usual, Xenophon had something to suggest. "It seems to me," he said, "that there are not many of them up there, and that it will not take long to exhaust their supply of stones." And then, having carefully examined the place, he added, "The dangerous piece of road is about 150 feet in length, of which 2/3 is covered with great pine trees, not very far apart. 1, or at the most 2 leaps, will take us from the shelter of one group of pine trees to the next, and then, when the stones begin to fail, we must run as fast as possible over the last 50 feet of open ground." About 70 men were entrusted with the task of freeing the approach to the fortress, and one of them hit upon a clever device for bringing down the stones as fast as possible. From beneath the shelter of a pine tree, he ran a step or 2 forward to attract the attention of the enemy, who at once hurled all their biggest stones at the place, but, before they could touch him, he was back under the shelter of his tree. He did this so often that at last there was quite a heap of stones lying in front of him, but he himself was untouched. The other men followed his example and made it a sort of game, enjoying the sensation, pleasant alike to old and young, of courting danger for a moment and then quickly escaping it. When the stones were almost exhausted, the soldiers raced one another over the exposed part of the road, each eager to be the first to reach the fortress. The Taochians made no further resistance, but, fearing the vengeance of the Hellenes, men, women, and children flung themselves over the edge of the cliff and were dashed to pieces. One of the soldiers, seeing a Taochian who appeared to be better dressed than the rest, about to throw himself over the precipice, ran up to him and tried to pull him back, but the Taochian grasped him in his strong arms and dragged him forward with him over the edge, so that both perished together. The Hellenes took few prisoners, but much spoil, cattle and asses in abundance, and whole flocks of sheep.